They say the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist. Perhaps his next greatest trick was obfuscating who he really is, where he came from, and what he's here to do, and how we can overcome him. Join us as we learn this supernatural evil entity opposed to God, who his original name was, when he fell, how he gained control of the demons and the other angels, how we can overcome him, and what his final destination will be. The Old Testament is quite ambiguous to this figure. Satan is a term most scholars say means adversary or accuser. It's not his name, although some recent scholarship points to a title of attacker or executioner as a more likely rendering. This term Satan is used of humans, angelic members of God's divine council, and even the angel of the Lord himself in the Old Testament. And the most descriptive portions of this supernatural entity with this designation is found in the book of Job. Here Satan is pictured as a divine figure as he's in heaven acting as a prosecuting attorney of sorts, accusing, harming, and testing Job, but only with God's permission. Although many believers today associate him strongly with the serpent in the garden, the Old Testament only has allusions in Isaiah and Ezekiel linking him to the Garden of Eden, and those are far from solid, as they are on their face addressing kings in both passages. However, if we attribute these passages to a supernatural enemy of God in a double meaning, as most scholars do, and we believe the entire divine council was present in the garden, then either of these passages could be speaking of any of the angels that were there that would later rebel. We will give more information in a follow-up video as to why these passages probably refer to another fallen angel. The oldest of the Jewish writings that do link a serpent in the garden to a fallen angel is the book of Enoch. But we have to ask, if Satan was the serpent who was cast down from heaven, how is he again in heaven working with God to test Job? The same question could be asked of those in modernity who believe Satan is the king of hell and is ruling it there right now. Also puzzling is the fact that in the Torah there seems to be several gods who opposed God, Yahuwah, those being Baal, Moloch, Astaroth, Dagon, etc., etc. But none of them seem to be more powerful or the leader of the bunch. But by the time we get to the New Testament, there is one main enemy of God, Satan. So how did Satan go from an ancillary figure in the Old Testament to the ruler of this world, even offering the Son of God control of the kingdoms of the earth, one who leads a supernatural army of fallen angels and demons, the one who is responsible for mankind being expelled from the garden and experiencing evil and death, and the one who will lead the entire earth to war against God and murder his chosen people, which will ultimately lead to the end of the world? The answer are books whom the Pharisees and post-Nicene Church discouraged their followers from reading, even calling them heretical. That is the Enochic/Essenic books of Jubilees, 1st Enoch, and some of the other Dead Sea Scrolls. Not only do these books fill in the gaps about Satan, they also bridge the Old and New Testament understanding of fallen angels, demons, hell and the afterlife, and eschatology and apocalypticism. Quote, in the intertestamental period, however, Satan acquires articulation and definition. The devil comes of age and begins to act independently, apart from the divine court. Satan now has his own agenda and his own band of cosmic lackeys. As early as the 1st century, certain Jewish groups such as the Essenes, the purported writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the followers of Jesus emerged and began to speak of Satan in concrete terms. Unquote. The Birth of Satan, Tracing the Devil's Biblical Roots, written by T.J. Ray. Quote, "The Book of the Watchers in 1st Enoch offered its readers an explanation of many of the world's problems. More precisely stated, the Book of the Watchers provided various explanations to account for a variety of humankind's troubles, to a period before the flood, when a group of rebellious angels descended to the earth, married human women, and revealed forbidden secrets to humans. Angelic revelation of heavenly secrets is to blame for some of humankind's problems. Other forms of sin and suffering stem from the angels' sexual immorality, and the terrible offspring that this immorality produced. Although the story of the sinful angels would enjoy widespread popularity in early Judaism, it is the Book of Watchers' teachings on demons and evil spirits that appears to have had the most significant and enduring influence on Jewish and Christian theology. According to the Book of the Watchers, evil spirits are the disembodied children of the sons of God, who inflict human beings with various manners of bodily harm." Unquote. The Satan, How God's Executioner Became the Enemy, Ryan E. Stokes. Quote, "Satan in both Job and Zechariah is one of the sons of God, that is, one of the heavenly beings. As God's emissary, Satan is involved in roving the earth and observing activities in the terrestrial sphere. What is different about the B'nai Elohim, or Watchers in Enoch, however, is that a leader emerges among the disgraced angels, variously called Azazel, Shemyaza, and later Satan. In bringing out the evil nature of the Watchers, the apocalyptic writers of Enoch contribute to the growing chasm between God and some of his sons, the B'nai Elohim. This separation is critical in understanding the emergence of Satan, for not only does the separation preserve God's goodness, but it also clears the way for a single being to become the antithesis of God." Unquote. Ray. I will here refer you back to my first Enoch video that explains why I feel like the Book of Enoch should be taken seriously. A few things are, it was quoted by several of the disciples and seemingly even Jesus, Yeshua himself, and many of the church fathers likewise gave credence to the Book of Enoch. So if this is true, and it was instrumental in the development of the theology of many things in the New Testament that were not found in the Old Testament, I ask, why should we not take it seriously when studying who these angels are, and if we can find Satan in there and what it has to say about him? So let's look at the Book of Enoch and see what it has to say. The Book of Enoch expands on Genesis 6:4 and tells how 200 angels fell and took an oath to mate with women led by Shemyaza along with Azazel, are said in Enoch to have been thrown into an abyss along with the other angels that took the oath and wives. I'll put it on the screen here, but I'm not going to read all this just so we can keep this video moving along, but this is found in chapter 6. "For their treachery, God said, the first to descend was to be placed in an opening in a desert and bound there until the end times. Raphael was tasked with imprisoning Azazel. Quote, bind Azazel hand and foot and put him in the darkness, make an opening in the desert which is in Duadel, and put him in there, and lay upon him rough and pointed rocks, and cover him with darkness, that he may remain there forever, and cover his face, that he may not see the light, and on the great day of judgment he will be cast into the fire." Many people like to say that Azazel is actually Satan, although we should note two things by this passage. The New Testament tells us that the archangel Michael will be binding Satan in the end times. Here it says Raphael was with imprisoning him. We can also see that Azazel is going to be under the earth with rocks put on top of him until the end times, whereas we know that Satan is in the heavenly realms and on earth, so we can confidently say Azazel is not Satan. Enoch 87 makes it clear that the first star is Azazel, who was the first to go down and commit this act, as he was the only angel who was cast into a separate abyss from all the others. Then the giants were made to kill each other, and the rest were cast into a separate abyss. Quote, And I saw one of those four who had come forth first, and he seized the first star which had fallen from heaven, and bound it hand and foot, and cast it into abyss. Now that abyss was narrow, and deep, and horrible, and dark. And as I was beholding in the vision, lo, one of the four who had come forth stoned them from heaven, and gathered and took all the great stars, whose privy members were like that of horses, and bound them all hand and foot, and cast them in an abyss of the earth. Azazel's crime of being the first to fall and mate with women was compounded by the occult knowledge and magical workings that he passed on. Quote, "You see what Azazel has done, who has taught all iniquity on the earth, and who has revealed the eternal mysteries that are in heaven, which the sons of men were striving to learn. And all the earth was made desolate by the deeds and the teachings of Azazel, and over him write all the sins." It was the Enochians' view that the magical workings and the secret knowledge passed on, along with the sexual union creating the Nephilim, and these would become the demons, that all of this stuff was so severe that it would lead to the end of the world, and there was nothing that humankind could do about it. Only a Messiah could correct this great sin that had occurred from these angels. I think the reason he was placed apart is so that the Lord could set up the Day of Atonement ritual in Leviticus 16, where one goat was designated for Azazel, and the figurative sin of all Israel was placed on this goat, and it was released into the desert, where the actual Azazel is. I think this was the purpose of having Azazel put into an abyss in a separate location, to give the Israelites a reminder each year of the damage this rebellion caused on the Day of Atonement. And he was chosen because he was the first angel who copulated with women, inaugurating this rebellion. Thus, as a reminder each year on the Day of Atonement, all of Israel's sin is figuratively placed upon him. Shemyaza was the other angel that is listed in Enoch as one of the leaders of this rebellion. He was their general, so to speak. He was credited with creating a supernatural army by leading the other watchers to marry human women. This supernatural army is the demons. Shemyaza was the first angel listed in chapter 6, and he seems to be the most powerful angel. Michael, a more powerful archangel than Raphael, was tasked with imprisoning him, but like Azazel and the other angels that bound themselves with women, he was also imprisoned under the earth until the end times. The book of Enoch makes it clear that the crime that was so terrible that caused all of them to be imprisoned under the earth was the making of the supernatural army, that is, the mating with human women, and creating beings that were never supposed to exist. And like we said earlier, the book of Enoch is the first book that definitively links the snake in the garden to a fallen angel and a Satan. And this is found in 1 Enoch chapter 69, quote, "And the third was named Gadre'el. He had led astray Eve." So in chapter 6, we have 20 leader angels who bound themselves with a very, very powerful oath, which we will talk about further in another video. And this oath was that they would not turn back from doing what they set out to do, that is, mate with human women. And the mating with human women was the cause for them to be locked away in Tartarus. And in chapter 69 we have Gadre'el, who, it says, was the snake in the garden. So how do we square all of this? Well, for one, we can see that Gadre'el is not listed in chapter 6. Is it possible he did not take the oath? I believe that's exactly what happened. Let me explain. The angels in chapter 6 all have pre-fall names. This makes sense, as you would assume. God is not going to name an angel with an evil name, because that would imply that he's predetermined that that angel will fall and be evil. And I don't think God has done this. He preserves free will and gives everybody a fair chance. Semitic language expert Nathaniel Schmidt tells us that the names of the angels we read in chapter 6 were their original names, with names such as God is perfect, shooting star of God, God is my ruler. Gadre'el is listed in chapter 69 among 5 other angels who obviously have post-fall names, such as rebel, God has abandoned. When we get to Gadre'el, we see that depending on the translation, which is in Giez, if it was translated from Hebrew or Aramaic, translates to God's traitor or fighter. This means that this angel has a pre-fall name. So, is there somewhere in Enoch where we can decipher what that may be? When comparing chapter 69 and chapter 6, we have a discrepancy. In chapter 6, it lists 20 angels being leaders over 10 each. That makes the math work out to the 200 that fell. But when we get to chapter 69, it lists 21 leaders. If we then look to a book called the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, a new edition in the light of the Aramaic Dead Sea Fragments by Michael A. Knibb, we can see that the extra angel in chapter 69 was inserted at the 13th angel, and this angel is Bezaleel. There is no Bezaleel in chapter 6, so it seems that this is the angel who was left out and did not take the oath. So, if we were to plot the angels in chapter 6 and match them up with the angels in chapter 69, which had the 21 leaders, and shortly after in chapter 69, the angels that had post-fall names, I think we can figure out exactly what happened. We can see that the first angel listed that has a post-fall name is Yaquan, and his crime matches up perfectly with Shemyaza, who is also listed number 1. Shemyaza is the first angel listed in chapter 6, and his crime of bringing angels to women is listed in chapter 7. An additional crime is listed in chapter 8 of spells and cutting of roots. But if we look at Yaquan from chapter 69, he has the exact same crime of the one who brought down angels to the daughters of men. So, Shemyaza becomes Yaquan, which means he shall rise and rebel. This is a powerful foreshadow of his future destiny, which we will cover in a future video. The second angel from chapter 6, Artakoth, his crimes are listed in chapter 8, and it is the signs of the earth. He is also listed in chapter 69 under the pre-fall names, and his pre-fall name meaning is God of the earth. His post-fall name is Asbeel, which means God has abandoned, and his crime is listed as counsel to the angels on how to defile their bodies with the daughters of men. This makes sense because he is the earth god. He taught signs of the earth. He would be an expert on earthly things, and he is the one who could actually tell the sons of God, being spiritual beings, how they could actually procreate with women who are of the earth. So far we have a 1-to-1 match. The angels with the post-fall names are in order with the angels from chapter 6 and chapter 69 with their pre-fall names. So Gadre'el is listed as number 3 in the post-fall names. If we are correct in identifying Bezaleel as the same being as Gadre'el, this is where he originally would have been. In chapter 6 and chapter 69, when listing the pre-fall names, number 3 is listed as Rameshel, which means evening of God. So it seems like Rameshel, meaning evening of God, originally not a leader, replaces Bezaziel, meaning shadow of God. It's kind of interesting that evening of God and shadow of God have very similar meanings. So Bezaziel steps down and does not take a wife and does not take the oath, which is why he's not listed in chapter 6, but why he was still listed in chapter 69, because he originally was one of the Watcher leaders. And Ramshiel, being not a leader, stepped up to take his place. Chapter 69 says that Gadre'el is the one who showed the children of men all the blows of death, and he led astray Eve. It also says, from his hand they have proceeded against those who dwell on the earth from that day and forevermore. As you can see, this angel was the snake in the garden, and this description of Gadre'el aligns perfectly with John 8:44, who called Satan a liar and murderer from the beginning. He lied to Eve and said, "You surely won't die," and was a murderer as he showed the blows of death. Not only did his lie cause death to enter by eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, He counseled Cain on how to murder his brother by the blows of death, the first murder. 1 John 3:12 says Cain was influenced by the evil one, Satan. This passage also says, from Gadre'el's hand forevermore they will proceed against those who dwell on the earth. In Dr. Douglas Hamp's book, Corrupting the Image 2, we can see why this angel, listed as number 3, so he may have been the third most powerful, we can see why he may have stepped down. An inscription was found at a temple at the summit of Mount Hermon, which again is where the angels are said to have descended down, and it is where they took the oath. And the inscription says, according to the command of the greatness personified bull god Batios, those swearing an oath in this place go forth. There is more to this oath than meets the eye, which, God willing, we will cover in a future video. But Dr. Hamp links this entity administrating the oath to Zeus, which, spoiler, we will link in this video to Satan himself. So, Bezaleel/Gadre'el may have stepped down so that he could administer the oath to the other leaders and angels, all of which took an oath, which was that they would actually go through with this evil deed of taking a wife. And this is why they were condemned. And this would be why all of them were sentenced to Tartarus, and he alone from this rebellion was left out. And this is how he is still roaming the earth like a lion, seeking to devour who he can, while the rest of the angels are locked away. The book of Enoch contributes a few other things that are worthy of note when looking at the theology of the New Testament. Enoch 54:6 has the first instance in any scripture that says Satan commands angels. Another important contribution is in Enoch 47. It says there will be a future day when the rebellious angels will no longer be able to accuse those on earth. And of course, Enoch gives the first witness, which would later be echoed in the New Testament, that the Satan and his angels will be cast into hell for their crimes. Another book we've talked about is key in the development of Satan seen in the New Testament. That is the book of Jubilees. It gives record of his activities after the flood, and we get the first hints that a supernatural, demonic army serves him. Quote, the book of Jubilees would develop the book of Watchers' teachings about spirits, demons, and the threats they pose to humankind. Jubilees would further elaborate that these menacing beings serve the Satan. With regard to the Satan, Jubilees portrays the Prince of Mastema in two different ways. In some passages, he appears as the divinely appointed chief of the evil spirits who mislead and afflict the nations of the earth. In other passages, he is the antagonist of Israel, who attempts to harm God's elect, unprovoked, presumably because of his character. Jubilees' author typically avoids calling superhuman beings by their names. In Jubilees' version of the Watcher's story, the names Shemyaza, Azazel, and others that appear in the Book of the Watchers are nowhere to be found. Different from Job and Zechariah, however, the primary superhuman Satan figure in Jubilees goes by the title the Prince Mastema, rather than the Satan. The Prince of Mastema is to be identified with Satan is clear from Jubilees 10:11, where the designation Satan or the Satan refers to this figure. As in the Book of the Watchers, evil spirits in Jubilees are responsible for physical maladies. In Jubilees 10:3, for instance, Noah's children complain to him that the spirits, demons, are blinding and killing his grandchildren. Also, like the Book of the Watchers, Jubilees credits evil spirits with misleading humans, and to commit all sorts of other wrongdoing, especially to shed human blood. Noah predicts they will completely destroy his descendants from the earth. Therefore, Noah asks God to have the spirits incarcerated and to save his descendants and humanity once again from total annihilation. When Mastema, the leader of the spirits, came, he said, Lord Creator, leave some of them before me, let them listen to me and do everything that I tell them, because none of them is left for me. I shall not be able to exercise the authority of my will among humankind. For they are meant for the purpose of destroying and misleading before my punishment, because the evil of mankind is great. Jubilees 10:8. So we can see here that after the flood, the Satan, Gadre'el, knows he will be judged, so we can definitively say he is a fallen being here. He knows he has erred in the garden and with Cain, and for administering the oath of the Watchers. We continue quoting from Stokes. Quote, "In the end, so that humankind will not be altogether destroyed, God has 90% of the spirits bound. God leaves 10% for the service of Mestema, however, for the purpose of punishing human wickedness. Not only are spirits and the Satan for the first time in literature incorporated into a single system of thought, but a hierarchy of superhuman realm is articulated in which the spirits, demons, are subordinate to the Prince of Mestema. By virtue of his association with evil spirits, the Prince of Mestema becomes the leader of these deceptive forces. The Prince appears in this capacity most clearly in Jubilees 11, which describes the time between Noah and Abraham, as one in which people were led astray by evil spirits to worship idols and commit acts of violence. Jubilees 15:31-32 provides further information regarding the difference between God's relationship with Israel and the deity's relationship with other nations. According to these verses, God has subjected all the nations of the world except for Israel to the deluding influence of evil spirits. This passage merges Jubilees' teachings on evil spirits with the theology of Deuteronomy 32:8-9. When the Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. The Lord's own portion was his people, Jacob his allotted share. According to Deuteronomy, the nations of the world have been allotted to certain divine beings called sons of God. In Psalm 82, the sons of the Most High, also referred to in this psalm as gods, Elohim, govern the nations of the earth. In the later apocalyptic book of Daniel, the nations of Persia, Greece, and Israel have supernatural princes who fight on behalf of their respective nations. Deceptive spirits play important theological roles in the teachings of Jubilees. Harmful spirits serve to distinguish the chosen people of God from the rest of humankind. They do this by leading all the nations except for the descendants of Jacob into sin. In contrast, Israel has received divinely revealed written instructions that affords them protection from spiritual delusion. Israel is protected from these spirits by the Torah that God revealed to Moses. The Prince of Mestema fits into this theological scheme as the chief of the evil spirits who deceive the nations. That Jubilees associates the Prince of Mestema with the harmful and deceptive spirits marks several important developments in the Satan tradition. From this point forward in the history of the tradition, it becomes commonplace for early Jewish texts to speak of the Satan as the leader of evil spiritual forces. Also, as a result of his association with deceptive spirits, the Prince of Mestema, the Satan himself, becomes a deceiver of humankind, not merely a punisher or attacker. Additionally, Jubilees' depiction of the whole world except for the elect as under the deceptive control of the Satan and his spirits would find a home in the theology and literature of early Judaism and Christianity." Unquote. We've covered in previous videos how the Tower of Babel incident was a serious rebellion of the fallen realm and had fateful consequences for the human race. It was here that Satan also gained control of the principalities over the nations as they fell. Here he became prince of this world. He was now in control of a supernatural army of angels and demons to attempt to directly challenge God. And from this point forward in Jubilees, we see a change in his character and function. And we can see here in Jubilees that there's protection for God's people. If they follow the law that God gave, they will not be subject to influence by these evil spirits. But if they break his law, that gives them legal ground to move in and afflict his people. Back to Stokes. Quote, "3 stories in Jubilees depict the Prince of Mestema not as a deceiver or punisher, but now as an unprovoked troubler of humankind. 2 of these stories, Jubilees' version of the sacrifice of Isaac and Jubilees' retelling of Israel's exodus from Egypt portray the prince of Mastema as the enemy of Abraham's descendants in particular, and even in one instance as the protector of Israel's enemies. In all three of these stories, the prince of Mastema opposes or is opposed by God's people. In Jubilees 11:11-24, the prince of Mastema appears as a troubler of humans who is thwarted by a teenage Abram. According to this story, in the days of Terah, the prince of Mastema induced a famine that impoverished humankind. When farmers would sow seed, the prince of Mastema would send birds to devour the seed before it could be plowed into the earth, rendering the earth barren. Farmers would frequently call upon Abram to assist them. Eventually, Abram invented a tool that allowed people to sow seed in such a way that it could not be eaten by birds. Thus, Abram blocked the prince of Mastema's attempt to deprive humans of agricultural produce. I would just like to note here that it's interesting to compare this story to the story of the parable of the sower that Jesus tells, where Satan, pictured as birds, eats the seeds representing the gospel of the kingdom, not being understood by people, and thus Satan plucks the gospel sown from their hearts. We also see Zeus, Satan, as being represented by a bird in mythology. We have one other bird reference that will be instrumental in an upcoming video. Quote, in Jubilees' account of the binding of Isaac, the prince of Mastema appears specifically as the enemy of God's people. Jubilees' version of Abraham's ordeal, which draws from the story of Job, opens as Abraham's faithfulness is lauded in heaven. The prince of Mastema, however, devises a test to ascertain the extent of Abraham's devotion. Quote, Abraham does indeed love his son Isaac and finds him more pleasing than anyone else. Tell him to offer him as a sacrifice on an altar. Then you will see whether he performs this order, and will know whether he is faithful in everything through which you test him. Unquote. Even though God does not doubt Abraham's devotion, God assents to the satanic antagonist's request and orders Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. He travels to the site of the sacrifice, builds an altar, binds Isaac, and places him on the altar. At this point in the story, which an angel of the presence narrates to Moses, quote, then I stood in front of Abraham and in front of the prince of Mastema, unquote. The angel of the presence intervenes and prevents Abraham from sacrificing his son. The prince of Mastema is a participant in God's heavenly court. He does not, however, merely take orders from God. He is capable of independent thought and action, and his contrariness is integral to the story. The prince of Mastema convinces God to test Abraham, even though God had already done so more than adequately to be confident of the quality of Abraham's piety. The test of the prince of Mastema devises for Abraham is entirely unnecessary. He convinces God to examine Abraham, even though, as Jubilees makes it very clear, the patriarch had already proven his faithfulness repeatedly. The idea that Prince of Mastema might launch an attack on someone that is completely without cause is borrowed from Job's prologue, where the Satan incites God against Job for no reason, Job 2:3. This passage differs from Job, however, in that Satan's proposal in Job at least has the merit of being based on the fact that Job's integrity was as of yet untested by adversary. Abraham, according to Jubilees, has already proven his steadfast loyalty by being obedient in a number of difficult circumstances. According to Jubilees, it is the prince of Mastema, not God, who would have Isaac killed. Indeed, Jubilees gives no indication that the prince of Mastema intends to stop Abraham from sacrificing his son. If the malevolent prince has his way, we are left to assume the test will run its course. Abraham will, once again, prove faithful, and Isaac will be dead. Fortunately for Abraham, Isaac, and their descendants, the angel of the presence intervenes just in time to save Isaac from the prince of Mastema's malicious plot. Jubilees' version of the story makes clear, nonetheless, that there is no deficiency in God's ability to assess Abraham's character, and no malevolence on God's part that brings Isaac so near to death. Rather, it is the prince of Mastema who puts the fate of God's people at risk. Unquote. And I would just like to note here that both the story of the birds, signified as Satan coming down to cause the famine by eating the seeds, and the binding of Isaac are both reminiscent of the red dragon in Revelation, who seeks to devour the seed of the woman. It is through the line of Abraham and Isaac that the Messiah would come. This also seems to go back to Genesis 3, where the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent are at war with each other. And if Satan had his way, he would have prevented the Messiah from coming by killing Abraham or Isaac in both of these stories. As God has now chosen his people through the line of Abraham, and he prepares to give them the Torah, we see the Prince Mastama strike again. Quote, "The Prince of Mastama is portrayed very similarly as the leading antagonist in Jubilees' Exodus account. The Prince of Mastama makes his first appearance in this narrative in the retelling of Exodus 4:24. In Exodus 4, Moses begins his journey from Midian to Egypt, where God has instructed him to demand the Israelites' release from Pharaoh. On his way to Egypt, an event transpires, the details of which are obscure. It appears that Moses encounters Yahuwah, who inexplicably seeks to take Moses' life in Exodus 4:24. God stops short of killing Moses. However, when Moses' wife, Zipporah, circumcises their son and touches the circumcised foreskin to Moses' feet, once again the Prince of Mastama tries to harm God's people, but the Angel of Presence steps in on behalf of Moses and Israel. Although the text is silent on the point of whether God authorizes the attack, it is clear that it is not God who intends to kill Moses, the Prince of Mastama does. This attempt on Moses' life is part of an effort on the prince's part to protect the Egyptians, Israel's enemy. As with Abraham's test, the Angel of the Presence steps in to defend the chosen people from the hostile prince's attacks. The Prince of Mastama comes to the aid of Egypt a second time. When Moses arrives there, Moses performs miraculous signs in order to convince Pharaoh to release the Israelites. In response, the Prince of Mastama enables the Egyptian magicians to match Moses sign for sign in 48:9. As we have come to expect, however, the angels of the presence comes to Israel's aid. In this case, the angels limit the Egyptian magicians' ability to compete with Moses. When, after a number of disastrous plagues, Pharaoh finally permits the Israelites to leave Egypt, the Prince of Mastama rouses the Egyptians so that the Egyptian army pursues the Israelites. As before, the angel of the presence comes to Israel's rescue and stands between the Israelites and the Egyptian army. God then makes a way for the Israelites to cross the sea as on dry ground and throws the Egyptians into the sea. The book of Exodus answers the question of why the Egyptians would be so emboldened as to pursue Israel, even after suffering plagues at the hand of Moses and Israel's God. It is the Prince of Mastama who hardens the heart of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, according to Jubilees 48:12 and 17. Jubilees said it was also God who hardened the Egyptians' hearts so that they would be thrown into the sea. Jubilees retells the story in a way that avoids the implication that God is responsible for Israel's troubles. The Prince of Mastama's activity in this story is similar to the testing of Abraham, his attempt on Moses' life, and his empowering of the Egyptian magicians. The Prince of Mastama is the enemy of God's people. He, not God, is behind the threat to Israel's well-being. Accordingly, Egyptian hostility towards Israel is the work of this prince. Jubilees 48:15 through 19 explains more fully the Prince of Mastama's activity and inactivity in the events surrounding Israel's exodus from Egypt. On the 14th day, the 15th, the 16th, the 17th, and the 18th, the Prince of Mastama was bound and locked up behind the Israelites so that he could not accuse them. On the 19th day, we released them so that he could help the Egyptians and pursue the Israelites. He stiffened their resolve and made them stubborn. They were made stubborn by the Lord our God so that he could strike the Egyptians and throw them into the sea. The reason the Israelites enjoyed Egypt's favor just long enough to pack their belongings and get out of Egypt is that for 5 days the Prince of Mastama was bound and unable to cause trouble for the Israelites. During these days, the wicked prince could not harden the hearts of the Egyptians. According to 48:18-19, when the Prince of Mastama incapacitated, the Israelites were able to plunder the Egyptians. When the Israelites asked the Egyptians for clothing and utensils of silver and gold and bronze, the Egyptians gladly handed these goods over to them. According to Exodus 12:35-36, it says the Egyptians' generosity was the result of the Lord making them favorably disposed toward the people of Israel. In Jubilees, God brings about this change of attitude on the part of the Egyptians by binding the prince of Mastema, who up until this point had been hardening the Egyptians' hearts. The Egyptians' good favor towards Israel is short-lived, however. After the 5 days, the angels of the presence release the prince of Mastema, who again hardens the Egyptians' hearts and incites them to attack Israel. Jubilees' Exodus account depicts an interesting dynamic in the relationship between God and the prince of Mastema. As elsewhere in Jubilees, God is clearly the superior of the two. The prince of Mastema in this story, however, is no mere functionary of the deity, obediently executing a duty that God has assigned him. He has an agenda of his own that is contrary to God's, to harm God's people by assisting Egypt against them. God, in contrast, has Israel's interest in mind and intends to punish the Egyptians. Despite this independence on the part of the prince of Mastema, ultimately he unwittingly serves God's purpose and accomplishes the will of the deity. God has the prince bound so that he will not oppose the Israelites, and has him released so that the Egyptian army will pursue them and be thrown into the sea. For this reason, 48:17 can say both that the prince of Mastema stiffened their resolve and made them stubborn, and that they were made stubborn by the Lord our God so that he could strike the Egyptians and throw them into the sea. The relationship between God and the prince of Mastema is such that the actions of the Egyptians can be attributed both to the work of God and to the work of the prince of Mastema. The intentions of the prince of Mastema and those of God are at odds, but ultimately God manipulates the prince in order to bring about good for Israel. Jubilee simultaneously teaches that it is the prince of Mastema who is behind the attacks on the elect, and that God manipulates this prince for the good of the elect. At the end of the story, the prince of Mastema is shamed, as he was when he attempted to have Abraham sacrifice Isaac. In Jubilee's account of the Passover, all the forces of Mastema, which Mastema just means hostility, were sent to kill every firstborn in the land of Egypt. The various depictions of the prince of Mastema in Jubilees share the understanding that God and the angel of the presence protect the descendants of Jacob from the superhuman forces who would destroy them. This understanding is perhaps where the unity of Jubilees material pertaining to the Satan resides. Jubilees presents the prince of Mastema both as one who serves God in leading the nations astray, and as one who supports the nations in an effort to destroy God's people. This Satan figure, who is responsible both for the sins of the world and for the troubles of the righteous, would be the Satan received by Jewish and Christian tradition." Unquote. Stokes. So, in Jubilees, we have this Satan figure emerging post-flood, where he takes control of the 10% of the demons that are left on earth. Then at Babel, as the principalities, these 70 or 72, depending on the translation, angels are given control over the nations, Satan likely led this rebellion too, and he gained control of these principalities. So now he has control over the demons and the principality angels. We can see that as God chooses his chosen people through the line of Abraham, he strays more and more and seeks to kill this chosen line, to destroy all of God's chosen people. And we see Satan attack again as Moses prepares to lead God's people out of captivity in Egypt, and as God is about to reveal the divine Torah to them, and this is the means that will protect them ultimately from delusion and attack from these evil spirits. Satan grows more unhinged as he sees his plan falling apart. If the Torah is delivered to the people, and the people keep it, they will be free from the influence of these evil spirits. And so Satan takes his attacks up another level, and attempts to destroy God's people directly. And that is when God has to send in the angel of the presence, to defend his people from Satan's direct attack. As we approach the events of the New Testament, the next documents that can help us understand this Satan figure that the New Testament will be speaking of is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Quote, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, one encounters a variety of beliefs about the Satan figure, who typically goes by the name Belial. One finds in the scrolls many of the perspectives on the Satan and the other maleficent superhuman entities that are attested in earlier literature, as well as some novel ideas about these beings. The Damascus document, in particular, adopts much of Jubilees' teaching about the Prince of Mastema and his spirits, although no text from the Dead Sea Scrolls clearly refers to a figure by the designation of the Satan. Numerous texts mention figures that correspond to the Satan of earlier literature, although they go by names other than the Satan. These include the Angel of Darkness, the Angel of Hostility, Belial, and Melchresha. The name Melchresha means King of Wickedness. Belial comes to be used as a name for the Satan in the centuries prior to the turn of the era, and is the preferred name of this figure in several of the Dead Sea Scrolls, such as 11Q Melchizedek, the rule of the community, and the war rule. The Greek form of the name Beliar appears in later texts, such as the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. The Greek form also occurs once in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians 6:15. Belial means worthlessness or wickedness. In addition to the name Belial, the Damascus document in one passage use Melech HaMashah, the angel of destruction or hostility. This title, which designates an angel who troubles those Israelites who do not keep the law of Moses, is probably an alternative title for Belial. Similarly, 1QM 13:10-11 refers to Belial as a hostile angel. The application of such terminology to this Satan figure recalls Jubilees' Prince of Mastema hostility. The activity of Belial very much resembles that of Satan of Jubilees. It claims that Belial assisted the Egyptians who opposed Moses and Aaron. Moses is helped by the angels of the presence in Jubilees 48:2-4, so Moses and his brother are empowered by the Prince of Lights in the Damascus document. And such is the verdict on all members of the covenant who do not hold firm to these laws. They are condemned to destruction by Belial. Another passage in the Damascus document speaks of divine judgment being executed by a group of angelic beings. Quote, but strength, might, and great wrath in the flames of fire with all the angels of destruction shall come against all who rebel against the proper way and who despise the law. Unquote. The angels of destruction in this passage resemble the forces of Mastema, who are sent to kill the firstborn in Egypt in Jubilees 49:2, or the envoy of destroying angels that is given this task in Psalms 78:49. Furthermore, the Damascus document shares with Jubilees the belief that keeping the law is Israel's means for protecting itself from the angel Prince of Mastema's attacks. Quote, therefore, let a man take upon himself the oath to return to the law of Moses. On the day a man promises to return to the law of Moses, the angel of obstruction will leave him, if he keeps his words. Unquote. The scholarly consensus has held that the Dead Sea Scrolls speak of a single leader of the forces of evil. According to this view, Belial is the name of Satan in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the figure of Belial corresponds to the Prince of Mastema in the Book of Jubilees. Similar to the Prince of Mastema in Jubilees, Belial punishes wicked humans, commands a host of spirits, leads humans to sin, and sides with Israel's national enemies against God's people in battle. Unquote. Stokes. One other scroll, 4Q 535 Manuscript B, also referred to as the Testament of Amram, gives us a glimpse of the type of angels the Watchers are. Quote, I saw Watchers in my vision, the dream vision. 2 men were fighting over me, holding a great contest over me. I asked them, who are you, that you are thus empowered over me? They answered, we have been empowered and rule over all mankind. They said to me, "Which of us do you choose to rule you?" I raised my eyes and looked. One of them was terrifying in his appearance, like a serpent, his cloak many-colored, yet very dark. And I looked again, and his appearance, his visage, like a viper. I replied to him, "This watcher, who is he?" He answered, "This watcher has 3 names, Belial, Prince of Darkness, and King of Evil." I said to the other watcher, "My lord, what dominion have you?" He answered, "You saw the viper, and he is empowered over all the darkness." Unquote. With the snake imagery, we can connect the watchers to seraphim angels. Quote, "The seraphim of Isaiah 6:2 that attend Yahuwah's throne may also have been fiery beings if the noun derives from the verb seraph, which means to burn. It is more likely that the seraphim derives from the Hebrew noun seraph, serpent." Unquote. Regarding the noun seraph in the Hebrew Bible, Journal for the Study of the Old Testament. And again, this burning or shining and snake harken back to the rebel of Eden. Quote, "The serpent is more than a mere snake." The term Nakash is a triple entendre. The serpent, Nakash, was an image commonly used in reference to a divine throne guardian. Given the context of Eden, that helps identify the villain as a divine being. The divine adversary dispenses divine information, using it to goad Eve. He gives her an oracle, or an omen. "You won't really die. God knows when you eat, you will be more like Elohim." Lastly, a shining appearance conveys a divine nature. Unquote. The Unseen Realm, Dr. Heiser. When we add back in these lost books and documents that were revered by early Jewish Essenes and the early church, we can better understand the New Testament teachings on Satan and the powers of evil. Quote, "Satan assumes a more commanding role in the New Testament, and his demonic minions in fact abound in the New Testament, appearing some 568 times, cropping up in unlikely places and challenging the ultimate authority of Jesus. Even though Satan's character is more clearly defined in the New Testament than it had been in the Hebrew Bible, as we shall soon see, Satan is now the arch-nemesis of Jesus. His essential function in the Bible remains unchanged. He is the troublemaker, the stumbling block, the adversary. However, even as the figure of Satan grows more confident, more powerful, and more insidious, blatantly challenging Jesus' authority and even infiltrating the ranks of those close to him, he is not allowed to move about in the world unopposed. Indeed, Jesus, the hero of the New Testament, steps forward to confront the villain at every turn. Although the devil may have a few tricks up his sleeve, the authors of the New Testament make it clear that Satan is no match for the obedient Son of God. Round after round, hero and villain spar in a struggle for universal supremacy, but at the end of the struggle, God scores a knockout, throwing Satan into a lake of fire and sulfur. Unquote. Ray. Quote, "The Satan was clearly an important figure for the authors of the New Testament. He is mentioned in 19 of the 27 books of the New Testament. This frequency differs markedly from that of the Hebrew Scriptures, only 2 books of which, Job and Zechariah, mention the Satan. In this respect, one can compare the New Testament writings with the sectarian Dead Sea Scrolls, and a great number of which refer to Belial. Thus, the New Testament, along with the sectarian corpus from Qumran, attests to the theological prominence the Satan had attained in some Jewish circles by the 1st century CE. It is also clear that the Satan is not merely a symbol for social evils or other sorts of sin in the New Testament. The New Testament books that refer to the Satan, like the Jewish texts considered in previous chapters, assume that he is an actual, personal being whose nefarious influence was behind many of the church's problems. The Satan appears in many texts to be God's enemy, but also in several passages to be more of a functionary who willingly serves God's purposes. Some of the ideas about the Satan found in the New Testament, in contrast, are previously unattested in Jewish literature. Some of these ideas would have circulated in Jewish circles outside Christianity, but happen to be preserved for the first time in the New Testament, such as the opposition between Satan and Christ portrayed in several New Testament passages. But even these previously unattested ideas of the Satan nonetheless have antecedents in early Jewish literature. In the case of Satan's opposition to Christ, one might compare this idea with the prince of Mastama's opposition to Moses in Jubilees 48, or Belial's opposition to Michael in the War Rule. Unquote. Stokes. Satan in the New Testament is understood as the entity which had the power of death over mankind, and only the Messiah could break this curse. Quote, "Because God's children are human beings made out of flesh and blood, the Son also became flesh and blood. For only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break the power of the devil, who had the power of death." Unquote. Hebrews 2:14. We also see the polarity of a battle between light and dark, as in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are only two sides, the world and wealth, or righteousness and heaven. Quote, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, which neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. No one can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." Matthew 6:19, 21, 24. And there are only two groups of people, those that proclaim the gospel and those who oppose it. Like in Qumran, there are the sons of light, God's true people, and everyone else, the sons of darkness. The Pharisees embodied this rival group most prominently in the New Testament. Revelation 3:9 calls Jews who persecute Christians the synagogue of Satan. Above these people are the spiritual powers of the duality, Yahuwah and Yeshua versus Satan and his angels and demons. Quote, "After Jesus heals the man, his critics cite the miracles as more evidence that Jesus does not meet their messianic qualifications. They say he casts out demons by Beelzebub, the ruler of demons, Luke 11:15. Beelzebub is an alternative name for Satan in the Synoptic Gospels. Jesus responds with, "Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and no city or house divided against itself will stand. If Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? If I cast out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your own exorcists cast them out?" Unquote. Matthew 12:25-27. This passage suggests by the time of the writing in the late 1st century, Matthew's audience would have assumed several things about Satan. Satan was the prince of demons, ruling an entire perverse kingdom dedicated to those forms of physical and mental illness that the ancients attributed to demon possession. Another implication is that Satan and his legion of demons were engaged in a conspiracy for world domination, for their kingdom of darkness to triumph over Jesus' kingdom of light. The Gospel of John tells the story of Jesus' life in terms of a cosmic battle between light and darkness, good and evil. Jesus is the cosmic redeemer who comes to earth to rescue the world from darkness and to cast out Satan, the, quote, ruler of this world. This cosmic war is similar to the Essene scenarios about a battle between the sons of darkness and the sons of light. John's Jesus has some rather strong opinions concerning the true identity of his opponents, going so far as to identify them as the children of the devil. Quote, "You are from your father the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies." John 8:44. John's Gospel follows the plot seen in some of the Qumran literature and in the Synoptics by depicting a redeemer figure who will rescue humanity from the grip of Satan. The battle is a familiar one, a struggle of good versus evil, expressed as a war of light against darkness. Unquote. Ray. One of Satan's primary jobs in the New Testament is his leading people into sin. Quote, "Some passages portray Satan as a tempter, tester, Matthew 4:1-11, 1 Corinthians 7:5, Revelation 2:10, or as one who otherwise lures the unsuspecting into error, Mark 4:15, Acts 5:3, 2 Corinthians 4:4, 2 Timothy 2:26, Revelation 12:9. Sins that the New Testament credits the Satan with instigating or attempting to instigate include idolatry, sexual immorality, and unbelief. as in several earlier texts like Jubilees and the Damascus document. The New Testament associates the Satan with idolatry and other traditional boundary-making sins. Further, according to some New Testament texts, the Satan is involved with a wide range of sins of various sorts. In Matthew and Luke's temptation accounts, Satan tempts Jesus to violate the Torah by testing God. James 4:1-10 attributes several sins to the devil's influence: disputes, conflicts, covetousness, pride, and friendship with the world. The New Testament clearly depicts the Satan as one who works delusion both within and outside the early Christian communities. Related to Satan's role as deceiver, several New Testament texts also speak of the Satan as the one who is ultimately behind the religious and political opponents of Christ and the early Christians. Paul refers to those false apostles who create problems for his ministry as servants or ministers of Satan in 2 Corinthians 11:14-15. Satan is also at work in Judas's betrayal of Jesus in Luke 22:3. In Revelation, the Satan gives his power to the beast who makes war on the saints. He also deceives the nations, gathering them for battle against the saints in Revelation 20:7-10. The Synoptic Gospels attribute illness to the Satan. As the chief of demons and spirits, the Satan is implicitly associated with the afflictions these beings cause. The connection between the Satan and physical suffering is explicit in Luke 13:10-17, where Jesus heals a disabled woman. Luke attributes the woman's condition to a spirit, but says also that it is a result of her having been bound by the Satan. In 1 Corinthians 5:5, the Satan was to destroy a sexually immoral man's flesh, quote, so that his spirit may be saved on the day of the Lord, unquote. In 2 Corinthians 12:7, Paul's thorn in the flesh, an angel of Satan who tormented Paul, was given to him to keep Paul from becoming overly elated. 1 Timothy 1:20 says that Paul handed Hymenaeus and Alexander over to the Satan in order that they would be taught not to blaspheme. They presuppose that the Satan is used as God's agent of attack for the purpose of punishing or disciplining errant humans, much as the Satan of earlier literature. In Revelation 12, the Satan and his angels are defeated in heavenly battle and are thrown down to the earth. Then a voice in heaven proclaims, "Now has come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God." This text depicts the Satan not as a punishing attacker, but as an accuser. It assumes that the Satan possesses some official standing in heaven that allows him to create problems for the righteous, but that his appointment to that office is not permanent. John speaks of a time when, as a result of the death of Christ and of the faithful testimony of the saints, the Satan will no longer accuse the comrades before God. Numerous New Testament texts, similar to the sectarian Dead Sea Scrolls like the Damascus document War Rule and Rule of the Community, depict the Satan as an evil figure. Given this emphasis in the New Testament and the trajectory of the tradition, it is understandable that the later Christian theology would characterize the Satan as God's enemy. In Luke 22:31, Jesus informs Peter that the Satan has demanded to sift Peter and the other apostles like wheat. In Matthew 6:13, Jesus instructs his followers to pray that God would not bring them into trial, but would deliver them from the evil one. The belief that the Satan would malevolently incite God against the innocent is also that from which John's understanding of the Satan as the accuser arose. Appropriately, Revelation 12 does not call the Satan the accuser of humankind or the accuser of sinners, but the accuser of our brethren. That the Satan malevolently incites God to test the faithfulness of the innocent also comports well with other statements in this book. John warns the church in Smyrna, "Beware, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, so that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have affliction. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life," in Revelation 2:10. In Revelation 12:11, the accuser of the comrades is defeated, in part by the faithfulness of the saints, for they did not love their lives unto the face of death. This statement in Revelation 12:11 echoes the stories mentioned above in which the Satan incites God against the righteous. The Satan contends before God in Job 2:4 that Job will be unfaithful to God in order to preserve his own life. In Jubilees 17:15, the Satan questions whether Abraham will prove unfaithful to God out of his love for his son Isaac. When Abraham demonstrates that he is willing to sacrifice what he loves most for the sake of his faithfulness to God, Jubilees says the prince of Mastama was put to shame. Whether the comrades would be unfaithful to God in order to save their own lives is what Satan tests in Revelation. The churches were to participate in the Satan's defeat by remaining faithful in the face of their trials and thus proving the allegations before God to be groundless. In addition to encouraging the churches to prove the Satan's accusations groundless by remaining faithful, it is possible that John believed that the sins that the churches had already committed needed to be accounted for as well in order to bring about the accuser's defeat. This would explain the role of the blood of the Lamb in Michael's victory over the dragon in Revelation 12. Interestingly, Revelation goes beyond Job, Jubilees, and other Second Temple era texts in the portrayal of Satan's accusation of the faithful before God in at least one respect. While several texts speak of an occasion on which the Satan goes before God to create problems for the righteous, Revelation teaches that the Satan engages in this activity constantly day and night. This sort of accusation is the essence of the Satan's activity before God in Revelation. John prophesies nonetheless that the Satan would be eventually defeated and lose his standing in heaven, putting an end to the Satan's work of inciting God to test the faithful. Although the book of Genesis does not associate the crafty serpent of Eden with the Satan, two New Testament books appear to mention the Satan in connection with this serpent, Romans 16:20 and Revelation 12:9 and 22. Near the end of this letter to the church in Rome, Paul warns the church not to be deceived by false teachers and then assures them the God of peace will shortly crush Satan under your feet. In 2 Corinthians 11:3, he mentions only the serpent who deceives Eve. Paul and John may have been among the Jewish interpreters of their era who believed that the Satan was involved in the rebellion of the first human couple, but they expressed no interest in explaining the story in the light of their doctrine of the Satan. Unquote. Stokes. When Yeshua chose to reveal his identity as Messiah, the Son of God, he deliberately chose the location because of its connection to Satan. Quote, Caesarea Philippi was located in the northern part of the Old Testament region of Bashan, the place of the serpent, at the foot of Mount Hermon. Things hadn't changed much by Jesus' day, at least in terms of spiritual control. You may have noticed on these maps that Caesarea Philippi was also known as Panias. The site was famous in the ancient world as a center of the worship of Pan, and for a temple to the high god Zeus, considered in Jesus' day to be incarnate in Augustus Caesar. Unquote. Dr. Heiser, The Unseen Realm. Likewise, in the Maccabean account of the Hanukkah story referenced in Daniel 9:26-27, the abomination of desolation was when Antioch Epiphanes, his name means God in the flesh, set up an idol of himself fashioned as Zeus in the holy temple, and a pig was sacrificed on the altar to defile it. The Greeks and the Romans had very similar religions, and when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the Roman army carried with them the Aquila. It is an eagle depicting Zeus's lightning bolt in its claw. It was a graven image that they carried with them into battle. Quote, the Romans did almost exactly the same thing in 70 AD. Upon seizing the temple, the Romans set up their ensigns on the eastern gate and offered sacrifices to them. Josephus, Wars 661. The main ensign was Aquila, the eagle that carried Zeus's lightning bolt. Here we see a veritable idol of Zeus, like that erected 200 years earlier by the Greek army in the Jewish temple during the Maccabean Wars. What animals did the Romans sacrifice? Historians believe a Roman army likely sacrificed the Survitalia in the temple that day in 70 AD. This is a ritual which is the sacrifice of 3 animals, a sheep, an ox, and a pig, for the purpose of land purification. It was customarily performed for the purification of a temple that had been destroyed. So the Romans set up an idol of Zeus in the temple and offered a pig sacrifice in it exactly like the Greeks did 200 years earlier, which Daniel 11:31 referred to as the abomination that caused desolation. Unquote. We should also note that both the Maccabean and the Roman sacking of the temple also involved extreme persecution of God's people if they would not compromise their beliefs and transgress the Torah. For example, if they were to circumcise their children would be killed and hung around their neck. If they were caught reading the Torah, they were killed. And some of them were even forced to eat pork at the point of torture and death. And Yeshua says this will happen again in the end of days, and in Revelation some saints will lose their heads for not taking the mark and bowing to the beast system. Quote, "And I saw the souls of them that had been beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God, and who had not worshipped the beast nor his image, nor had received his mark upon their foreheads or on their hands, and they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years." Unquote. Revelation 24. So we see this association between Zeus and the defilement of the temple in the Maccabean account and the Roman sacking of the temple. If we read in Revelation 2, we can see that it says, quote, "And to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. Yet you hold fast my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells." Unquote. So Yeshua says, "I know where you dwell, where Satan has his throne." So what is in Pergamum that we can derive Satan's throne to be? In this particular instance, scholars have several reasons they believe that Yeshua pronounced this city as Satan's throne. One, it was the place where a literal 40-foot high altar that resembled a throne where people made sacrifices to Zeus all day, every day. This throne was on top of an 800-foot hill next to the city. Anyone traveling to the city would encounter the image and smoke from the throne miles before reaching the city. You can still see this throne today at the Pergamum Museum in Germany. The German engineer Karl Humann excavated the site one brick at a time and transported it to Germany in order to rebuild it. Hitler used the blueprint for the altar to Zeus to build his own altar, from which he delivered his speeches. Pergamum was also where the temple was built to the god Asclepios, who was thought to be the god of healing. People flocked to the temple from all over the known world to seek healing by lying on the floor of the dark temple and allowing snakes to crawl over their sick bodies. Their symbol was a snake on a staff, which we still see in medical images today. This association of Satan with Zeus fits with the association between Satan and Beelzebub, as 2 Kings identifies this with Baal. Both Baal and Zeus were storm gods, and are in fact the names for Satan in those respective cultures. We read from 2 Kings 1, "Now Uzziah had fallen through the lattice of his upper room in Samaria and injured himself, so he sent messengers saying to them, 'Go and consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, to see if I will recover from this injury.' But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah, 'Go up and meet the messengers of the king of Samaria and ask them, Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going off to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore this is what the Lord says, you will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die.' So Elijah went." A little bit later, it talks about how Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind or tornado. It is likely that Baal-zebul means Lord of the heavenly dwelling, and Baal-zebub was likely a derogatory pun used by the Israelites, which means Baal of flies. So they're saying he's not the Lord of the heavenly dwelling, he is the Lord of flies, which is associated with death. And Lord of the heavenly dwelling, Baal-zebul, is reminiscent of Ephesians 2:7, which says Satan is the prince of the power of the air. 1 Kings 18 records an account of a contest between Elijah and Jezebel's priests. Both sides offered a sacrifice to their respective gods. Baal failed to light his followers' sacrifice, while Yahuwah's heavenly fire burnt Elijah's altar to ashes, even after it was soaked with water. The observers then followed Elijah's instructions to slay the priests of Baal, after which it began to rain. The lighting of the sacrifice was most likely lightning, and then the rain afterwards, it showed Yahuwah's mastery over the weather. So, although Baal is a storm god, Yahuwah is obviously more powerful in that regard. So, Zeus and Baal are Satan, and they have the same symbols. They both have a thunderbolt, a bull, and Baal has a ram, while Zeus has the planet Jupiter and an eagle as their symbols. And again, we see a bird symbol being associated with Satan. We quote again from Ray, quote, "A great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth." Revelation 12:3-4. I would just like to note here that this is the only passage that people derive their understanding of a third of the angels fell. This is not necessarily saying that when the great red dragon swept with his tail, he caused a third of the angels to be fallen angels. This simply could mean that a third of the angels came down to fight against the dragon, and the dragon was the cause of them coming down. Let's keep reading. "The great red dragon, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world." Revelation 12:9. Harrison notes, quote, "In the Jewish tradition, the serpent or dragon symbolized the power of evil, the principle of all the suffering of Israel," unquote. The imagery of the dragon, then, was probably quite familiar to the readers of John. They would have recognized the ancient serpent as the liar who deceived Eve in Genesis 3, and the dragon as the mythological monster of chaos, which readily symbolized the power of evil. Such images abound in the Old Testament. "On the day the Lord, with his cruel and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeting serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea." Isaiah 27:1. "You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters, you crushed the heads of Leviathan." Psalms 74:13-14. "By his power he stilled the sea. By his understanding he struck down Rahab." Job 26:12. Other images may have come to the audience's mind, including the 10-horned monster mentioned in Daniel 7, the Greco-Roman sea monster Hydra, the legendary Canaanite sea monster Lotan. The beast in Revelation 12, with his horns, tail, and red color, has influenced later descriptions of Satan's physical appearance. While this great red dragon with 7 heads resembles Leviathan, Hydra, and Lotan, the difference is this beast, is in the sky, and this beast, this dragon, actually later in Revelation stands on the seashore and watches Leviathan himself come up from the sea. So although it has characteristics of Leviathan, the great red dragon is not Leviathan, although it may resemble Leviathan because it represents the same thing, and that is chaos. Quote, "The dragon stands before a woman who symbolizes Israel in labor." Revelation 12:1-2. "The beast is intent on devouring her child as soon as it is born." The child born to the woman, Israel, transparently refers to the Messiah, who is quickly dispatched to the throne of God in Revelation 12:5, thus slipping through the murderous clutches of Satan. In this brief passage, John summarizes the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. The woman flees into the wilderness where she is protected by God. The rescue of the child unleashes a war in heaven. This dragon seeking to devour the seed, I think, is prequeled in Abraham, where Satan, as birds, tries to cause a famine who would have prevented Abraham from living if he was successful. Likewise, it's prequeled with the binding of Isaac. If Satan was successful there, then Isaac would be dead, and his son, Jacob, who became Israel, would not have been born, and this is where Christ comes from. And I also think another fulfillment was what happened on September 23rd, 2017, where the same astrological alignment happened exactly how it did when Christ was birthed in 9/11/3 BC. The forces of good are led by the guardian angel of Israel, Michael, and his heavenly troops war against the evil forces led by Satan and his demonic cohorts. The war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great red dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him in Revelation 12:7-9. In fact, the fall to earth so enrages Satan that he resumes his pursuit of the woman, now symbolizing Israel, or the church, who gave birth to the Messiah. Unable to destroy her, he turns towards her children and makes war on them. So when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child, but the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness to a place where she is nourished for a time, times and a half a time. Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went to make war with the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Yeshua, Revelation 12:13-17. So who is Satan angry with? Who are the children of the woman? Those who keep the commandments of God and have the supernatural testimony, prophecy, revelation, and guardianship of Jesus Yeshua. So Satan is the red dragon in the heavens. He comes down to earth and sees another beast come out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns. And this is who the Antichrist emerges from. The false prophet is the beast from the land who causes all to worship the image of the beast, whom Satan also teams up with. We'll attempt to detail all this in a future video and identify these players. This is all highly reminiscent of the fall of the temple and the worship of Satan in the temple as Zeus in the Hanukkah story and the Roman sacking of the temple. However, there is one more parallel that highly mimics this, and that is Babylon, which gives further confirmation of Satan's involvement in the building of the Tower of Babel. We quote again from Dr. Douglas Hamp's book, Corrupting the Image, too. Quote, "In the 7th to 6th century BC, Nabopolassar, the father of Nebuchadnezzar, the one who performed the repairs on a tower, stated, 'At the time, my lord Marduk told me in regard to Temin Anaki, the ziggurat of Babylon, which before my day was already very weak and badly buckled.' So he did not begin the construction of the tower or lay its foundations. He tried to repair what someone long before him had abandoned. In his next statement, quote, 'to ground its bottom to the breast of the netherworld and to make its top vie with the heavens,' unquote, echoes the purpose of the ziggurat as a bridge between heaven and earth. He then states how it was, quote, 'through the craft of exorcism, the wisdom of Ea, and Marduk, I purified this place and made firm its foundation platform on its ancient base,' unquote. He then says, 'In its foundations I laid out gold, silver, gemstones from mountain and sea. I bowed my neck to my lord Marduk. I rolled up my garment, my kingly robe, and carried on my head bricks and earth. I had soil baskets made of gold and silver, and made Nebuchadnezzar, my firstborn son, beloved in my heart, carry alongside my workmen earth mixed with wine, oil, and resin chips. For my lord Marduk, I made it an object fitting for wonder, just as it was in former times.'" It goes on to say, "A former king built it, they reckon 42 ages ago, but he did not complete its head. Since a remote time, people had abandoned it without order expressing their words," unquote. This is all highly reminiscent of the Tower of Babel in the Bible, which said it was made with stone bricks and that it was stopped and was not completed because the languages were confused. And of course we know the story about what King Nebuchadnezzar did to Daniel, and we'll read from Daniel 3. Quote, "King Nebuchadnezzar ordered a gold statue to be built, 60 cubits high and nearly 3 cubits wide," and that width would be on both sides, so that would be 60, 6, and 6. There's your 666. Quote, "Anyone who refuses to worship this golden statue will be thrown into a flaming furnace." Quote, "Those Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to worship your gods and the statue you have set up. And so they were thrown into the furnace. And they were saved by," Quote, "But I see 4 men walking around in the fire," the king replied. "None of them is burned up or harmed, and the fourth one looks like a god." So we have people that refuse to transgress God's commandment of not bowing down to the beast, and they are going to be killed, although in this case they are saved by a fourth one in the fire, and this is probably a pre-incarnate Yeshua. It is very likely that this golden statue was dedicated to the same god that the ziggurat was being repaired to, and that is Marduk. Now, Marduk is the Babylonian storm god, and so we have the same connection to Zeus and Baal. All 3 examples of Nebuchadnezzar, the Hanukkah story, and the Roman sacking of the temple, they all involved forcing people to transgress God's commandments at the point of torture and death. Those that disobeyed and would not do so, they are killed. However, in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, a remnant of believers also survives, sometimes with the help of the angel of the Lord. In all 3 cases, this is a shadow of Revelation with the mark of the beast, that we see people are forced to bow down to an image of Satan, the god of this world. Quote, "The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority." Revelation 13:2. And people worship the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. They also worship the beast in Revelation 13:4. Certainly, as in Satan's testing of Yeshua, he does have control over the principalities and nations he acquired from the Tower of Babel, and thus is able to give an earthly king that power. Quote, "Then the beast was permitted to wage war against the saints and to conquer them, and it was given authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation, and all who dwell on the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life belonging to the Lamb who was slain. He who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, into captivity he will go. If anyone is to die by the sword he will be killed. Here is a call for perseverance and faith of the saints." Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. This beast had 2 horns like a lamb, but spoke like a dragon. And this beast exercised all the authority of the first beast, and caused the earth and all who dwell on it to worship the first beast, whose mortal wound had been healed. And the second beast performed great signs to cause even fire from heaven to come down to earth in the presence of the people. Because of the signs it was given to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image to the beast that had been wounded by the sword and yet had lived. The second beast was permitted to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship it to be killed. Revelation 13. Since dominion of the earth was given to Adam, it is a man that is destined to be in control of the entire earth. This is why Satan gives power to the beast, that is, the Antichrist, because he is a man. And then we see another beast rising out of the earth. This is the false prophet. He looks good, he looks like a lamb, but he speaks like a dragon. And he has the ability to perform great signs and wonders. It says he deceives a lot of people, and he has great magical powers. And he makes fire come down from heaven, and has everybody make an image of the first beast, and even gives life to that image, and forces everybody to worship it. We quote again from Ray. "Then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against the rider of the horse and his army," in Revelation 19:19. The beast and his army are defeated. The commanders, the beast and the false prophet mentioned in Revelation 13, are thrown alive into a burning lake, and their followers are killed and their corpses picked over by birds. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and with a loud voice he called to all the birds that fly in heaven, "Come gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of the kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of the mighty, and the flesh of horses and their riders, flesh of all, both free and slave, both great and small." Revelation 19:17-18. The agents of Satan are thus destroyed, and only the devil himself remains at large. Then I saw an angel come down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit, and a great chain. He seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and locked and sealed it over him, so that he would deceive the nations no more until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be let out for a little while. Revelation 12, 1-3, unquote. And this, of course, is the millennial reign, a Sabbath for the whole earth, where there is no more Satan. The first resurrection has occurred, and those in Christ have been given their new, incorruptible bodies. The great regathering has occurred, and they reign in New Jerusalem, teaching the whole earth the law, and all nations will learn it and celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles at this nexus of heaven and earth year by year. This is the great regathering, and listen to these passages, and you will see that it has not yet happened. Quote, Jerusalem will be a city without walls. Come, Zion, escape who live in daughter Babylon. Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, for I am coming, and I will live among you. Many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day, and will become my people. I will live among you, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. The Lord will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem. Zechariah 2. Yet behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when they will no longer say, As surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. Instead, they will say, As surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of the land of the north, and all the lands which he had banished them. For I will return them to their land that I gave to their forefathers. Many peoples will come and say, Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Unquote. Isaiah 2:3. Then the survivors of all the nations that have attacked Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. If any of the people of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, they will have no rain. Unquote. Zechariah 14. Obviously, the modern-day Israel and Jerusalem is not a city without walls, a city in peace. And people still speak of the first Exodus and do not speak of a greater Exodus that is to occur. And people do not go there to worship or to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, and they will not have rain otherwise. So, the modern state of Israel is not the fulfillment of these prophecies. No, it is when the New Jerusalem comes down, and the whole earth will be tabernacling with God. Those inside the walls who have their first resurrection, new bodies, those outside the walls are those that did not take the mark of the beast, but they were not righteous enough to inherit eternal life in the first resurrection. At the end of this 1,000 years, Satan will be released from the pit one last time. Quote, When the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth. Revelation 20:7-8. Satan incites the nations to join him in the final battle against Christ and his church. Satan's legions are vast, as numerous as the sands of the sea. Revelation 28. But despite their number, Satan and his army are quickly defeated. And fire came down from heaven and consumed them, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Revelation 20:9-10. Satan is the arch-villain in command of an army of monsters and demons pitted in a battle against God, the Lamb, the angels, and the saints. Moreover, this terrifying combat is truly cosmic in scope. The arena of his battle now includes heaven, earth, and the underworld. The fiendish figure in Revelation represents Satan in his final biblical form, a terrifying monster who is far removed from his humble beginnings. He has become the apotheosis of evil that lurks around every corner, the antithesis of all that is good. Unquote. Ray. So we can see that in the Old Testament, Satan is only mentioned specifically in 2 books. He's basically contemporary with the other gods. He's not explicitly listed as the snake in the garden, and his judgment is a little bit ambiguous. Although the Enochic literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls aligns highly with the New Testament, where he is the leader of demons and fallen angels. He is explicitly listed as the snake in the garden, and his judgment is not ambiguous. He is imprisoned in fire and possibly annihilated. And the Enochic literature and the New Testament tells us that through righteousness of faith and law, and through Yeshua, or the angel of the presence, we are able to overcome this enemy. The Enochic literature and the New Testament tells us through righteousness of faith and law, and Yeshua, or the angel of the presence, we are able to overcome this enemy. Ephesians 6:11 says to put on the whole armor of God, so that we can withstand the wiles of the devil. It says that we war not against people, flesh and blood, but against cosmic powers over the age of this present darkness, and against spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. It tells us to put on the belt of truth. What is truth? Truth is defined as the Torah. It says to put on the breastplate of righteousness. Righteousness is defined as faith and by keeping God's law. It says as shoes on our feet, we're supposed to have the readiness of the gospel of peace. It says to take up the shield of faith and the helmet of salvation, which Yeshua gives us to put on our head. And we're supposed to wield the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. So we have to be in the Word. We have to know the Bible. And this, combined with the Holy Spirit, is how we are able to slay this ultimate enemy. I pray this video has been a blessing for you. Thank you for watching. Shalom. There lurks in the shadows one that may surpass the power and depravity of Satan, and he's once again returning to rule.